It was a chilly Monday morning when Margaret Wilson carefully stepped out of her worn-out Toyota Corolla, clutching her black leather handbag close to her chest. At 78 years old, she had made this trip to First National Bank 3 times already, each visit ending in disappointment and frustration. The autumn wind rustled through her silver hair as she adjusted her outdated reading glasses. Margaret had spent 42 years teaching third-grade students at Lincoln Elementary School, but nothing in her long life had prepared her for the challenges of dealing with modern banking bureaucracy. Her husband of 51 years, Robert Wilson, had passed away 3 months ago after a brief battle with cancer, leaving her to navigate a maze of paperwork and procedures alone. Inside her handbag were all the documents she had gathered: Robert's death certificate, their marriage license, joint account statements, and even their old wedding photograph from 1972. The security guard, a young man named Tom who had seen her on her previous visits, gave her a sympathetic smile as she walked through the glass doors. The bank's interior was intimidating with its sleek marble floors and tall columns. Modern art hung on the walls, and the sound of clicking keyboards and quiet conversations filled the air. Margaret made her way to the waiting area, her arthritis-troubled knees protesting with each step. The leather seats were too low for someone her age, but she managed to lower herself carefully, placing her handbag on her lap. Number 23 called out the electronic display board. Margaret looked down at her ticket, number 47. Her heart sank, knowing she would have to wait for at least an hour, maybe more. She pulled out her old flip phone to call her daughter Susan, who had offered to come with her today. But Margaret had declined, determined to handle this on her own. "I'm not helpless," she had told Susan that morning. "I taught hundreds of children over 4 decades. I can surely handle a simple bank matter." Now, sitting in the cold waiting room, she was beginning to regret that decision. As she waited, Margaret observed the other customers: young professionals in suits rushing in and out, college students making quick deposits, and middle-aged couples discussing mortgages with bank officers. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing, moving through their transactions with ease and confidence. The joint savings account she shared with Robert contained their life savings, $127,000 that they had carefully accumulated over their years of teaching. They had planned to use it for their retirement, for traveling to see their grandchildren in California, and for emergency medical expenses. Now, Robert's medical bills were piling up on her kitchen table, and she couldn't access their savings because of what the bank called procedural requirements. 2 hours passed slowly. Margaret had already counted the ceiling tiles twice, 347, and memorized the names of all 6 tellers working behind the counter. Her arthritis was acting up, and the small breakfast she'd had, just toast and tea, felt like a distant memory. Number 47, the electronic board finally displayed. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her belongings and walked to counter 5, where a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a crisp white blouse sat staring at her computer screen. "How may I help you today?" the teller asked without looking up, her fingers continuing to type rapidly. "Good morning," Margaret said politely, her voice slightly shaky. "I'm here about accessing my joint account. You see, my husband passed away 3 months ago, and I've been trying to." "Do you have an appointment?" the teller interrupted, finally looking up with an expression of mild annoyance. "No, I don't. The last time I was here, they told me to just come in with the documents," Margaret explained, beginning to pull out the carefully organized papers from her bag. "I'm sorry, but for deceased account matters, you need to schedule an appointment with our estate department. We can't help you at the counter," the teller stated flatly. Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as other customers began to glance in her direction. "But I was here last week, and they told me." "Those are the rules, ma'am. You'll need to make an appointment. You can do it online or call our customer service number," the teller said, already looking past Margaret to the next customer in line. Just as tears of frustration began to well up in Margaret's eyes, the bank's glass doors swished open, and a wave of whispers swept through the lobby. Little did Margaret know that this moment would change everything about her ordinary Monday morning at First National Bank. The whispers grew louder as Margaret wiped away her tears with a wrinkled tissue from her handbag. She hadn't even turned around to see what was causing the commotion behind her, too absorbed in her own humiliation. The young teller's eyes suddenly widened, and her dismissive expression transformed into one of shock. "Is everything all right here?" A male voice asked from behind Margaret. Before she could turn around, the bank manager, Mr. Thompson, seemingly appeared out of nowhere, the same manager who had been unavailable during her previous visits. His face was flushed as he hurried toward counter 5, straightening his tie nervously. "Mr. Musk, what an unexpected honor!" Mr. Thompson exclaimed, but he wasn't looking at Margaret. Instead, he was addressing someone standing behind her. Margaret slowly turned around and found herself face to face with Elon Musk himself. He was dressed casually in a black t-shirt and jeans, looking exactly like the pictures she'd seen when her grandchildren showed her news about Tesla cars on their phones. "I asked if everything was all right here," Musk repeated, his attention focused on Margaret rather than the flustered bank manager. "I couldn't help but overhear your situation, ma'am." The entire bank had fallen silent. The security guard, Tom, stood with his mouth slightly open. The customers in line had their phones out, recording the unexpected scene. The teller who had just dismissed Margaret was now standing up, her face pale. I'm just trying to access my account," Margaret explained softly, her voice trembling. "My Robert, he passed away 3 months ago, and I've been coming here, trying to—" "3 months?" Musk interrupted, turning to face Mr. Thompson. "How long does it typically take your bank to process joint account transfers after a death?" Mr. Thompson began to sweat visibly. "Well, you see, sir, there are procedures and protocols." "I didn't ask about procedures," Musk said firmly. "I asked about typical processing time." 3 to 5 business days, the manager admitted, staring at his shoes. Margaret watched in amazement as Elon Musk pulled up a chair from a nearby desk and sat down next to her. "Tell me everything from the beginning, Mrs. Wilson." "Margaret Wilson," she replied, still stunned by the turn of events. For the next 10 minutes, Margaret explained her situation while Musk listened intently. She told him about Robert's medical bills, about their life savings, about the 3 previous visits to the bank, and about all the documents she had gathered. The bank staff stood frozen, watching as one of the world's richest men sat beside an elderly woman in a public bank branch, giving her his full attention. Customers had forgotten their own transactions, captivated by the scene unfolding before them. "So let me get this straight," Musk said, turning back to Mr. Thompson. "Mrs. Wilson has all the required documents, has made multiple visits, and you're still denying her access to her own money." "There might have been some miscommunication," the manager began. "Miscommunication?" Musk raised an eyebrow. "Or age discrimination?" The word discrimination seemed to echo through the bank's lobby. Mr. Thompson's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "I'll handle this personally," Mr. Thompson quickly assured them. "Right now, if Mrs. Wilson would just follow me to my office." "No," Musk stated firmly. "You'll handle it right here, where everyone can see how you treat your elderly customers. Mrs. Wilson has been humiliated enough in private offices." Margaret felt a surge of strength as Musk gestured for her to show her documents. She pulled out each paper, carefully organized in a folder, and placed them on the counter. The same teller who had dismissed her earlier now scrambled to process them, her hands shaking slightly as she typed. "I'm curious," Musk said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "how many other elderly customers receive this kind of treatment at First National Bank? Perhaps this is something the media should investigate?" The typing sounds in the bank grew more frantic. Margaret noticed several bank employees making urgent phone calls, while others huddled around computers. The atmosphere had completely transformed from just minutes ago, when she had been just another elderly woman they could easily dismiss. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a morning that would change not only Margaret's life, but also the way First National Bank, and many other banks, would treat their elderly customers in the future. The bank lobby had become a flurry of activity. News of Elon Musk's presence had somehow leaked to the local media, and through the glass doors, Margaret could see reporters gathering outside. Mr. Thompson was now personally handling her paperwork, his hands trembling as he processed each document. "Mrs. Wilson," Musk said, still seated beside her, "would you mind telling me about Robert? I'd like to know about the man who saved up this money with you." Margaret's eyes softened at the mention of her late husband. While the bank staff scrambled around them, she pulled out the old wedding photograph from her bag. "This was us in 1972, she said, her voice growing stronger. Robert taught high school physics for 45 years. He loved explaining how things worked. Musk studied the photograph with genuine interest. A physics teacher? That's remarkable. Did he follow the space program? Oh my, yes. Margaret's face lit up. He was so excited about your SpaceX launches, he would wake up early to watch them live, even in the hospital. Her voice caught for a moment. Even in his last week, he was watching the Starship updates on his tablet. The bank manager paused his frantic typing, listening to the conversation. Several customers had moved closer, captivated by the unexpected humanity of the moment. The last video he watched was about Tesla's new solar panels. Margaret continued. He turned to me and said, "Maggie, that Musk fellow is going to change the world. You would have never believed you'd be sitting here today." Musk seemed genuinely moved by her words. He was about to respond when a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. The bank's regional director, James Hartford, had arrived, having been urgently summoned by the staff. "Mr. Musk, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience," Hartford announced as he rushed over. "We can move this discussion to our executive conference room." "Actually," Musk interrupted, "we're quite comfortable right here. Mrs. Wilson has been waiting 3 months. I think she deserves to have her matter resolved in front of everyone who witnessed her mistreatment." The regional director's polished demeanor faltered slightly. He turned to Margaret, finally acknowledging her presence. "Mrs. Wilson, I assure you this situation is highly irregular. Our bank has strict protocols." "Your protocols," Musk interjected, "seem designed to frustrate elderly customers until they give up. I'm curious, how many other Robert and Margaret Wilsons are out there being denied access to their life savings?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Through the windows, the crowd of reporters had grown larger. Someone in the bank was apparently live streaming the entire scene, as customers had their phones raised, recording everything. Mr. Thompson returned with a stack of processed paperwork. "Mrs. Wilson, your account access has been fully restored," he announced, his voice carrying an apologetic tone that hadn't been there before. "We've also waived all processing fees and added compensation for your inconvenience." Margaret's hands shook as she reviewed the documents. Everything she had been fighting for over the past 3 months had been resolved in less than an hour. "There's one more thing," Musk said, turning to the regional director. "I want a written policy change on how you handle cases involving elderly account holders, and I want it implemented across all your branches." Hartford nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Musk. We'll draft new procedures immediately." "Send them to my office for review," Musk replied. "I'll have my team ensure they're actually customer-friendly this time." Margaret sat there, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. The same bank that had ignored her for months was now falling over itself to help. The same staff who couldn't spare her a minute were now offering her water and asking if she needed anything. As the paperwork was being finalized, Margaret noticed something strange. The other elderly customers in the bank were being approached by staff members, asked about their needs, and assisted promptly. The bank's treatment of seniors was changing before her eyes. "Robert would have loved this," she whispered, touching her wedding ring. "He always said one person could change things if they tried hard enough." Musk smiled at her words, but his attention was already shifting to something else he had noticed during their conversation. Something about Margaret's story that would lead to an even bigger transformation in how society treats its elderly citizens. The morning's events were far from over. As Margaret finished signing the last of her documents, Elon Musk was deep in thought. Tapping away on his phone, the bank lobby remained unusually quiet, with everyone watching the scene unfold. Suddenly, Musk looked up from his device with renewed purpose in his eyes. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "you mentioned Robert's medical bills earlier. Would you mind telling me more about that?" Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a stack of wrinkled bills, her hands trembling slightly. "These came after everything. The insurance didn't cover all of his treatments. I've been trying to figure out how to pay them, but without access to our savings." Musk carefully examined the medical bills, his expression growing more serious with each page he reviewed. The regional director, who was still hovering nearby, tried to peek at the amounts but quickly looked away when Musk glanced up at him. $300,000, Musk said quietly, but in the silent lobby, everyone heard him. For 8 weeks of cancer treatment. The reporters outside the bank were pressing their faces against the glass now, their cameras flashing. Inside, customers were whispering among themselves, some wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the scene. Robert didn't want me to worry about the money, Margaret explained, her voice breaking slightly. He kept saying everything would be fine. He was always the optimistic one. Musk stood up suddenly, pulling out his phone again. "Give me a moment, Mrs. Wilson." He walked a few steps away and made a call, speaking in hushed tones. The bank staff and customers strained to hear, but could only catch fragments about healthcare initiative and pilot program. When he returned to Margaret's side, there was a determined look on his face. "Mrs. Wilson, would you be willing to share your story with others? Not just about the bank, but about everything, the medical bills, the bureaucracy, the struggle to access your own money." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then straightened her shoulders. "If it would help other people in my situation, I'd share anything." Musk nodded, then turned to address the growing crowd in the bank. "What's happening to Mrs. Wilson isn't just about one bank's policies. It's about how our entire system treats elderly citizens. The banking issues, the medical bills, the complicated processes, it's all connected." He pulled up a chair and sat down again next to Margaret. "I'm launching a new initiative today, right here in this bank. We're going to create a support system for elderly Americans dealing with financial and medical challenges. And Mrs. Wilson, if you're willing, you'll be our first case study." The regional director stepped forward eagerly. First National Bank would be honored to participate in any program. "Your bank," Musk interrupted, "will be an example of what needs to change. Starting with covering all the fees and penalties Mrs. Wilson incurred while trying to access her account." Margaret watched in amazement as the bank officials nodded vigorously, practically falling over themselves to agree. The young teller who had dismissed her earlier was now holding back tears, clearly affected by the unfolding events. "But that's just the beginning," Musk continued, now addressing both Margaret and the onlookers. "I'm going to have my team look into creating a simplified banking system for elderly customers. No more running around with papers, no more waiting for hours, no more bureaucratic loops." He turned back to Margaret. "And those medical bills? Consider them handled. But more importantly, we're going to work on making sure no other elderly couple has to drain their life savings just to stay alive." The bank lobby erupted in applause. Through the windows, the gathered crowd outside had grown even larger, with news vans pulling up to the curb. Margaret sat in her chair, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. "Robert would have loved this," she said softly, touching the wedding photograph on the counter. "He always said technology should help people, not complicate their lives." Musk smiled, picking up his phone as it buzzed with incoming messages. "Your husband was right, Mrs. Wilson, and his story, your story, is going to help us make that happen." As the morning continued to unfold, neither Margaret nor anyone else in the bank realized that this was just the beginning. What had started as one elderly woman's struggle with a bank was about to transform into a nationwide movement for elderly rights and support, all because she had refused to give up on accessing the savings she shared with Robert. The real changes were just about to begin, and First National Bank's lobby would forever be remembered as where it all started. The events at First National Bank had triggered a media frenzy. As Margaret sat in her chair, still processing everything that had happened, television crews had set up their equipment outside. Through the glass doors, she could see reporters doing live broadcasts, gesturing toward the bank's entrance. Elon Musk was now pacing the lobby, engaged in what seemed to be an important phone call. "Yes, set up the press conference for 2 p.m., he was saying, "and make sure we have representatives from major elderly care organizations there." The bank's regional director, Mr. Hartford, had brought Margaret a cup of tea and was now hovering anxiously nearby, trying to catch snippets of Musk's conversation. The other bank customers had forgotten their own transactions entirely, many of them recording the scene on their phones. "Mrs. Wilson," Musk said, returning to her side, "how are you feeling? I know this is a lot to take in." Margaret wrapped her weathered hands around the warm teacup. "I came here today expecting another rejection," she said softly. "Instead, I feel like Robert is somewhere up there, pulling strings to make all this happen." A small smile crossed Musk's face. "Speaking of Robert," he said, pulling up something on his phone, "I had my team do some research while we were handling the paperwork. Your husband published several papers on physics education during his teaching career, didn't he? Margaret's eyes lit up. Yes, he was particularly proud of his work on making physics accessible to struggling students. He developed a special program using everyday objects to explain complex concepts. We found them, Musk said, showing her his phone screen. These teaching methods, they're brilliant in their simplicity. Did you know some schools are still using his techniques? Before Margaret could respond, the bank's doors opened, and a familiar voice called out, "Mom." Susan, Margaret's daughter, rushed through the crowd of reporters, her face flushed with worry. "I saw you on the news. Are you okay?" She stopped short when she realized who was sitting next to her mother. "Susan," Margaret said, her voice stronger now, "you won't believe what's happened. Mr. Musk here didn't just help me with the bank account. He's going to use our story to help other elderly people too." Musk stood to greet Susan, but his phone buzzed again. After checking it, his eyes widened slightly. "Mrs. Wilson, your story has already gone viral. The hashtag Justice for Margaret is trending nationwide. People are sharing their own stories of elderly parents and grandparents struggling with banks and medical bills." The regional director, who had been monitoring the situation on his own phone, stepped forward. "Sir, our bank's CEO is on his way here personally. He's requesting an urgent meeting." "Perfect timing," Musk replied. "He can be part of the press conference where we announce the Elder Care Initiative." Margaret looked confused. "Elder Care Initiative?" "Yes," Musk said, sitting back down. "While we were talking, I had my team draft the preliminary framework. We're going to create a comprehensive support system for elderly Americans. Simplified banking services, medical bill advocacy, technology training, and more. And it all started because you refused to give up, Mrs. Wilson." Susan, who had taken a seat next to her mother, was wiping tears from her eyes. "Dad would be so proud, Mom." The young teller who had dismissed Margaret earlier approached their group hesitantly. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I want to apologize. My own grandmother passed away last year, and she faced similar challenges. I should have been more understanding." Margaret reached out and patted the young woman's hand. "Sometimes it takes a moment like this to open our eyes," she said kindly. Musk checked his watch. "The press conference is in 2 hours. Mrs. Wilson, would you be willing to share your story? People need to hear it from you directly." Margaret thought about Robert, about their life together, about all the other elderly couples facing similar struggles. She thought about the 3 months she'd spent fighting the system alone. Finally, she straightened her shoulders and nodded. "Robert always said that when you have a chance to help others, you take it," she said firmly. "I'll tell our story." As the bank staff began preparing for the press conference and more media crews gathered outside, Margaret realized that her morning of humiliation had transformed into something much bigger than herself. What started as a simple quest to access her bank account was about to become a movement that would change the lives of elderly Americans across the country. And somewhere, she was sure, Robert was smiling. The bank's conference room had been quickly transformed into a makeshift press center. Bank employees cleared away the large oval table, replacing it with rows of chairs for the media. Margaret sat in the front row with Susan beside her, watching as television crews set up their equipment. Elon Musk was in deep conversation with his team in the corner, occasionally glancing at his phone and nodding. The bank's CEO, who had arrived minutes earlier in a helicopter, stood nervously to the side, his usual confidence notably diminished. "Mom," Susan whispered, holding Margaret's hand, "are you sure you're up for this? It's been such an overwhelming morning." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "I keep thinking about all the other Roberts and Margarets out there," she said softly. "Someone needs to speak for them." The room gradually filled with reporters and cameras. Margaret recognized faces from local news stations, and there were even crews from national networks. The story had spread faster than anyone anticipated. At exactly 2 p.m., Elon Musk stepped to the podium. The room fell silent, cameras flashing. "Today began like any other day at First National Bank," he started, "until I witnessed something that perfectly illustrates a crisis in our society. Mrs. Margaret Wilson, a 78-year-old retired teacher, was being denied access to her own savings after losing her husband." He gestured toward Margaret, and all cameras turned to her. She sat straighter, remembering how Robert always told her to face challenges with dignity. But this isn't just about one bank or one widow, Musk continued. This is about a system that has failed our elderly citizens. Today, we're launching the Elder Care Initiative, a comprehensive program that will revolutionize how we support our senior population. The bank's CEO stepped forward when beckoned, looking uncomfortable as Musk announced, First National Bank has agreed to be our first partner in this initiative. They will implement new protocols for elderly customers, with simplified processes and dedicated support staff. Margaret watched as the CEO nodded vigorously, knowing his bank's reputation hung in the balance. The same institution that had dismissed her hours ago was now promising revolutionary changes. But we're going further, Musk announced. Using artificial intelligence and technology, we're creating a support system that will help elderly Americans navigate banking, healthcare, and legal challenges. And leading this initiative will be someone who understands these challenges firsthand. He turned to Margaret. Mrs. Wilson, would you please join me? With Susan's help, Margaret made her way to the podium. The cameras clicked rapidly as she stood beside Musk. My husband, Robert, she began, her voice shaking slightly before growing stronger, spent his life teaching young people about physics. He believed that complex things could be made simple if you approached them the right way. Today, I learned he was right. She pulled out her wedding photograph, holding it up for the cameras. This is who we're fighting for. Not just Robert and me, but all the couples who worked hard their whole lives only to face a system that seems designed to defeat them. The room was completely silent now, every eye fixed on the elderly woman who had found her voice. 3 months ago, I lost my husband, Margaret continued. Today, I found a way to honor his memory by helping others who are facing the same struggles we did. Musk returned to the microphone, announcing the details of the initiative. AI-powered banking assistance, medical bill advocacy programs, and a nationwide support network for elderly citizens. But the reporter's attention kept returning to Margaret, who stood tall beside him, becoming the face of a movement she never expected to lead. As the press conference concluded, a young reporter raised her hand. Mrs. Wilson, what would you say to other elderly people facing similar challenges? Margaret thought for a moment, then smiled. Robert used to tell his students that the universe is full of forces we can't see, but they're always there, pushing things in the right direction. Today, I learned he was right about that too. Don't give up. Your voice matters, even when it feels like no one is listening. The room erupted in applause. Outside, through the bank's windows, a crowd had gathered, holding signs with supportive messages. Hashtag Justice for Margaret had evolved into hashtag Elder Care Now, and social media was flooded with similar stories from across the country. What began as one woman's struggle was transforming into a national movement, and Margaret Wilson, the retired teacher who had simply wanted access to her savings, was becoming its unlikely hero. The real work was just beginning, and no one, especially Margaret, could have predicted where this extraordinary day would lead next. The hours following the press conference transformed First National Bank into a hub of activity. Television crews conducted interviews, social media influencers live-streamed from the lobby, and a steady stream of elderly citizens began arriving, each with their own stories to tell. Margaret sat in what had now become her chair, with Susan managing the growing number of people who wanted to speak with her mother. Elon Musk had set up a temporary command center in the bank manager's office, his team working rapidly to turn his promises into action. Mrs. Wilson called a young woman in a Tesla uniform, approaching with a tablet. Mr. Musk would like you to see something. On the screen was a website, still under construction, titled The Wilson Initiative, named after Robert and Margaret. The homepage featured their wedding photograph and Robert's quote about invisible forces in the universe. This will be the central platform, the woman explained, where elderly citizens can access all the services Mr. Musk announced. We've already had over 50 banks reach out, wanting to join the program. Margaret touched the screen gently, looking at Robert's smiling face. He would have loved seeing technology used this way, she said softly. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the bank's entrance. An elderly man, probably in his 80s, had arrived with his daughter. He was waving a stack of medical bills. I saw you on the news, he called out to Margaret. I've been fighting the same battle with a different bank for 5 months. Margaret gestured for him to come closer. As he shared his story, others gathered around, nodding in recognition of their shared struggles. The bank staff, who had spent the day watching this transformation, began bringing chairs for the elderly visitors and offering water and coffee. Meanwhile, Musk emerged from the manager's office, his phone still glued to his ear. "Yes, we're implementing it nationwide," he was saying. "Every branch, every bank that joins the program. Full accessibility, simplified processes, dedicated elderly care representatives." He paused by Margaret's chair. "Mrs. Wilson, would you believe the White House just called? They want to discuss making this a federal program." Margaret thought about how differently this day could have gone. If Musk hadn't walked into the bank this morning, she would have returned home defeated once again. Instead, she was watching a revolution unfold. The regional director approached their group, looking both exhausted and excited. "We processed over 50 elderly accounts today alone," he reported. "Cases that had been stuck in our system for months. Our new elderly care desk will be operational by tomorrow morning." As the afternoon turned to evening, Margaret noticed something remarkable. The bank staff who had dismissed her that morning were now sitting with elderly customers, patiently helping them navigate paperwork. The young teller who had been so cold was now explaining banking procedures to an older gentleman, speaking clearly and respectfully. "Mom," Susan said gently, "maybe we should head home. It's been a long day." But before Margaret could respond, Musk turned to her with one more surprise. "Actually, Mrs. Wilson, if you're up for it, we'd like you to help us design the training program for bank staff. Who better to teach them about elderly customers' needs than someone who's lived through this?" Margaret thought about all her years as a teacher, about Robert's passion for making complex things simple, about all the elderly people who needed help. "I'll do it," she said firmly, "but I have one condition." Everyone leaned in to hear what she would say. "We need to remember this isn't just about banking or medical bills," she explained. "It's about dignity. Every elderly person who walks through these doors has a lifetime of stories, just like Robert and me. They deserve to be heard." Musk nodded, understanding perfectly. "The Wilson Initiative will be built on that principle," he promised. "Every policy, every program, every training session will start with that reminder." As the sun began to set outside the bank's windows, Margaret looked around at what her difficult morning had sparked. Elderly people and their families were connecting, sharing stories, and finding hope. Bank employees were learning valuable lessons about empathy and respect, and somewhere, she felt certain, Robert was watching it all unfold with pride. The day was ending, but Margaret Wilson's journey was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they built this initiative from the ground up, but for the first time in months, she felt ready to face whatever came next. After all, as Robert always said, the universe had a way of pushing things in the right direction. 1 year later, Margaret Wilson stood at the podium in First National Bank's main lobby, addressing a crowd gathered for the first anniversary of the Wilson Initiative. The bank looked very different now, a warm, welcoming space with comfortable seating, clear signage, and dedicated elderly care representatives wearing bright blue Wilson Initiative badges. "A year ago today," Margaret began, her voice strong and clear, "I walked into this bank feeling helpless and alone. Now, I stand here representing over 2 million elderly Americans who have been helped by this program." Elon Musk sat in the front row, nodding as she spoke. The initiative he had spontaneously launched that morning had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Over 3,000 banks across the country had joined the program, each implementing the elderly-friendly policies that began in this very lobby. Robert used to say that one small change could create ripples across the universe. Margaret continued, touching the silver locket around her neck that held their wedding photo. "I never truly understood what he meant until now." The statistics displayed on the screen behind her told an impressive story. Medical bill assistance programs had helped over 500,000 elderly citizens. Simplified banking procedures have processed more than 1.5 million accounts, and the AI-powered support system had handled countless cases of elderly financial concerns. But the numbers weren't what made Margaret most proud. It was the cultural shift she had witnessed. Banks across the nation had transformed their approach to elderly customers. The young teller who had dismissed her that fateful morning was now the head of elderly care training at First National Bank, teaching others the importance of patience and respect. "Mrs. Wilson," Musk said, stepping up to the podium. "Would you like to announce our next phase?" Margaret smiled, remembering how Robert would have loved this moment. "Today, we're expanding the Wilson Initiative beyond banking," she announced. "We're launching programs in healthcare facilities, government offices, and public services, anywhere elderly citizens might need support." The crowd applauded as Susan joined her mother on stage, carrying a familiar black leather handbag, the same one Margaret had clutched nervously a year ago. From it, she pulled out the old wedding photograph. "This photograph has become a symbol," Margaret explained, her voice softening. "It reminds everyone in our program that behind every elderly face is a lifetime of stories, dreams, and contributions to society." The bank's CEO, who had once arrived in a panic to handle a PR crisis, now stood proudly with his elderly care team. The Wilson Initiative had transformed his bank's reputation, making it a model for institutional change. "But our work isn't finished," Margaret continued. "Today, we're asking every business, every organization, every institution to join us, because what began as one woman's struggle has become a movement for dignity, respect, and support for all elderly citizens." As she concluded her speech, Margaret noticed something that brought tears to her eyes. Through the bank's windows, she could see elderly customers being greeted warmly, helped patiently, and treated with the dignity they deserved. The scene was repeating itself in banks across the country. Elon Musk approached her as the crowd dispersed. "Your husband was right," he said quietly, "about the universe pushing things in the right direction. Sometimes it just needs a little help from people like you, Mrs. Wilson." Margaret looked around at what her moment of humiliation had created: a nationwide movement, millions of elderly lives improved, and a lasting legacy in Robert's memory. The Wilson Initiative had become more than a program. It was a reminder that every person, regardless of age, deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. As she gathered her belongings to leave, a young bank employee approached her with a familiar question. "Mrs. Wilson, would you tell us again about the day it all started?" Margaret smiled, remembering that morning 1 year ago when she had walked into the bank feeling powerless and alone. Now, she walked these halls as a symbol of hope and change, carrying Robert's memory and wisdom with her. "It started," she began, "with a simple wish to be heard." And as she shared her story once again, Margaret Wilson knew that somewhere, Robert was smiling, watching as those invisible forces he loved talking about continued pushing the universe in exactly the right direction. The end.